Hello and welcome. My name is Damien Retzinger. We're going to be talking about Daffodil and how it relates to PWA Studio and Vue Storefront today. To give you guys a little bit of background on who I am, I am a software engineer and I'm kind of the architect. I don't know, James Zetlin at the Adobe team calls himself the suzerain of front end, but I'm the architect of Daffodil essentially. Um, I do anything from front end to back end to ops infrastructure, but those are all beside the point. Today we're going to be talking about this little PWA framework for Angular called Daffodil. Um, so I kind of want to start off by talking about precisely what Daffodil is, because it's not necessarily very clear when people talk about something like PWA Studio or Vue Storefront what they really are. A lot of the times when you talk about something like them, you talk about the affordances they provide. So, for example, you may talk about how uh, it allows you to do offline shopping. Those are affordances of PWAs in general. They're not necessarily affordances provided by um, the framework itself. And they don't, oftentimes when you talk about something like PWA Studio or Vue Storefront or Daffodil, you don't talk about the developer experience of using this specific tool. Um, so, for example, we may want to talk about like, if I was a developer, how would I go about using one versus the other? So, for example, because I'm going to give some comparative examples because that's kind of the whole point here. Um, Daffodil isn't necessarily just a software thing that you deploy and voila, it works. Much in the same way that PWA Studio isn't that thing. PWA Studio is a conglomerate of multiple packages of a variety of different types. In the same way, Daffodil is a conglomerate thing. Daffodil is a suite of packages. It's actually just a simple set of node packages, which are within them Angular packages. Um, but I'll try to explain at a high level what these packages do, what affordances they provide, and some of the key concepts that underlie all of the packages that kind of constitute the entirety of the Daffodil PWA framework. Um, so I'll start off with one simple package called the contact package. So the contact package is a single Daffodil package that is deployable with Angular. So let's say you're building an Angular app and you would like to add a contact form to your app. A lot of the times, a developer will have to go create, maybe a state diagram, or they'll have to store some state for like, okay, well, what are the forms, or like, what is the model of this contact form? What are the required fields? What do I do when I click the submit button? I have to go query some endpoint. I got to send a post request of information to whatever endpoint so that the business says, oh yeah, I got a contact submission, hooray. Um, you maybe also want to store like a loading state that says, hey user, this thing is loading. We're waiting for the request to complete. And you also probably want to store something like a failure message or a success message. This is a really common pattern that comes up in UI development. This is not like anything terribly special. Uh, but when you're doing these kinds of things, this concept appears everywhere. It's all over the place, and it's not necessarily just a contact form. It might show up when you're creating a cart for a customer. Like, you come to a website for the very first time and you go click an add to cart button. That means that you as a user have a cart associated with you, and um, all of that stuff happens behind the scenes. There's this cart somehow in storage which you're interacting with as a user. Um, and a lot of the times, if you're a developer, you got to spend a tremendous amount of time writing kind of this binding layer between your UI code and your backend platform of choice. So I'm going to talk about specifically here Magento, and I'm going to specifically talk about how Daffodil differs in its interaction with Magento from another platform, or not a platform, but a PWA framework, something like, um, I'll just pick Vue Storefront as an example. So Vue Storefront, when you're interacting with something like creating a cart, um, makes a request from your front end, your UI code, to a middleware. There's actually an Elasticsearch, and I'm pretty sure this is true. There's an Elasticsearch instance or MongoDB instance which sits in between your e-commerce framework and uh, your e-commerce, or then your front end. So there's this middleware system that you have to set up, and you make a request. Could be GraphQL, could be a simple JSON request to some REST API, could be anything really. But you're going to make a request from your UI code to the middleware, and then the middleware is going to either make the request or return a cache response from from the middleware, and then turn it back to your UI code. All along the way, you're considering what does the model of that object, that cart object that we're talking about, what does it look like? And you have to consider it from various perspectives as a developer. So first of all, you have to consider it from this perspective of your UI code. What is this thing that I'm looking at? And what can I render for my user to see? And then you have to say, okay, what am I sending when I send a request back to the middleware to do maybe an update or to add a card item, for example? What do I send to the middleware? And then the middleware's concern is what do I end up sending back to Magento or your e-commerce framework of choice. So something like Vue Storefront has something like an Elasticsearch instance as a middleware. Something like PWA Studio utilizes a proxy framework called Upward to do these kinds of transformations and translations to the appropriate endpoint. Daffodil approaches this problem slightly differently. When we started Daffodil very, very long ago, we were acting under the assumption that the developer experience for a UI engineer, someone who's working on UI code, was really, really, really abysmal. If you've ever spent any time in Magento 1 and tried to write, let's just call it pleasant experiences, really, declarative experiences of UI, where you're trying to say, maybe make a really fun and enticing user experience for a customer. Doing that for something like Magento 1 was really, really painful. Not only because, the utility libraries that we had back then, like jQuery, were not so good, but on top of that, the complexity of maintaining all of the various modules and pieces that maintain the ecosystem of that UI code is really unwieldy, and many of the architectural patterns that exist in Magento 1 don't lend themselves to really efficient UI development. On top of that, if you tack on to the transition to Magento 2, Magento 2 has a similar style of problem where the UI is unwieldy, and especially if you're a front-end developer, you're going to know basically one of three frameworks. You're going to know React or Vue or Angular. You're not going to know or want to know the specific UI language of the e-commerce platform. You're not going to want to know, let's say, if we're talking about Shopify, you don't really want to know Liquid. If you're talking about Magento 1, you don't want to know how to use PHTML files in the layout XML. You don't really want to do that. If you are talking about Magento 2, you really don't want to have to know Knockout. So that's the premise from where this starts. And when we started Daffodil, the idea was, if I'm a developer, I don't want to have to know anything other than my UI code. I don't want to have to know anything other than Angular. So if we were to implement something like a middleware, like PWA Studio did with Upward or Vue Storefront with Elasticsearch, that would be a mistake from our perspective. So instead, what we did was we created a hexagonal architecture driver model. So much like when you're thinking about, if you're familiar with the PHP package doctrine, or the deval package, you think about, like, you don't really care about knowing various flavors of SQL. You don't care about knowing MySQL versus MS SQL versus SQLite. All you really care about is, I know SQL, I know how to make SQL requests, and you leave the actual underlying implementation to the driver of the particular framework. So we took that hexagonal architecture model and we turned it into drivers that are dependency injectable in Angular. So to kind of bring this all the way back up, if we think about the contact package, you send a model of a typical contact form contains like an email and a name, and you send it to a contact driver in your UI. And that contact driver then under the hood, depending on how you've configured your system, uses, I'm going to pick arbitrary platforms, HubSpot or the Magento Contact API, or some Salesforce API if you like Salesforce, or the Shopify API if you like the Shopify GraphQL API. There could be a million different vendors of endpoints. And you as a UI developer don't care about that endpoint. All you care is that you have specified a driver. You say, I want to use HubSpot, and you make your request and it works. But the important consideration here is that we didn't have to install any secondary software on top of Angular. There's no middleware thing like Upward. There's no Elasticsearch instance like Vue Storefront. There's nothing. You make your request. Your drivers are configured, and this all runs in the browser. Your drivers are all configured by how you build your Angular project, and the requests are all, how the requests are made under the hood is all abstracted to the individual package. So you might think, okay, cool. I have these, platform agnostic drivers where I can make requests for every package in whatever format, and I can use whatever platform I choose. Hooray! But you might be thinking, okay, well, likely your UI code is going to become really bloated because now you have all these drivers that are sitting in your UI. One of the main reasons we chose Angular, and this is actually one of the very particular reasons we chose Angular, is that Angular supports something called tree shaking. So if you don't use a driver, it's actually tree shaken away. So, the contact driver might have hundreds of various platforms that you can choose from. But behind the scenes, if you don't use all of them, it doesn't matter. The Angular compiler will throw out all of the drivers that you don't actually end up using. So your UI code is actually fairly thin. So as a result, you get a really, really small bundle for your code, and what you actually deliver to your customer is really tiny. So I talked a lot of things there. I'm going to kind of recycle back and talk about some of the really key concepts that I just outlined along the way. So the first one, Daffodil's drivers or Daffodil's packages are platform agnostic packages that support drivers. Each package supports a unique set of drivers. So for example, we might have a Shopify, sorry, not a Shopify driver, but rather a Stripe driver for payments. Obviously not all platforms out of the box support Stripe. So it's going to be, each package is going to define its own available drivers, and it's going to be up to the app developer to say, I want to use Stripe with Magento because let's say Magento supports Stripe. It doesn't out of the box, but let's say it did. It's up to them to know, what platform supports what. But beyond the actual implementation details of that, it's not up to the UI developer to know anything about that. Additionally, let's say in the future, you're a UI developer and your business opts to switch from Magento to Shopify, assuming Shopify supports Stripe, it does. You could actually just swap the driver from the Magento Shopify driver to the Magento Stripe driver to the Shopify Stripe driver, change none of your UI code, and you're done. And this is all supported. If you were to go hop into the Daffodil demo on our GitHub page, I'll just pull that up here real quick. If you were to go pop open the demo, which is contained in the apps demo folder, you'll see a driver file in there, which contains how you configure drivers. And in short, it's super easy. Swapping a driver is literally a single line of code change, and maybe you configure your endpoint. So you say, okay, well, I'd like to switch from the Shopify Stripe driver to the Magento driver, and then all you end up doing is changing a single line of code, changing the endpoint because obviously the domain is going to be different, and that's it. Then you're done. So platform agnostic drivers is one main piece of Daffodil. Additionally, the drivers are all tree shaken. So the drivers that you use are the only ones that show up in your final bundle. So your UI code is really, really tiny. And as a result, we actually don't have to have a middleware layer or a secondary piece of software that can fail along the way with Daffodil. On top of that, I talked about packages and things, and these packages have drivers. So I talked about contact. If you want to use some packages but not others, we don't provide a meta package for Daffodil. We don't intend to provide one either at the moment. We want people to use Daffodil packages, as they need them, in order to make sure that the final UI code remains small. So as a comparison to PWA Studio, you deploy Venia, which is the PWA Studio theme, and you maybe customize it, or you go build your own. We will never end up providing a theme for Daffodil at all because it's intended for you to go build your UI, and we provide all of the difficulty of building an e-commerce UI with our Daffodil packages. So we actually provide you like a state diagram. So if you're familiar with Redux, we provide a Redux state diagram for every one of our packages, and we also provide a set of actions which correspond to the state modifications or state mutations in the package. And we actually even provide the effects layer so that if you wanted to quickly scaffold a feature, you can import the driver, the state, and the effects. We have a concept called facades, which binds your which allows you to select values off your state tree. So for example, if we're talking about contact again, if you wanted to check the loading state, you can quickly select that off your contact state tree, and then you're really done. So we have these state models, and we have actions and effects, which all allow you to quickly scaffold a particular feature. And then finally, with all of this, I want to talk about before I open this up to questions, server-side rendering, because that's a huge consideration for a bunch of different people. Angular, as a result, so this is a happenstance for Daffodil. It's not like something that we considered ahead of time. Angular is a really well-supported product by Google, and the universal rendering engine, which is Angular's server-side renderer, is really, really powerful. And since we don't have any middleware code other than the drivers, all our code is Angular code, we, out of the box, get server-side rendering with very little effort. And we even get server-side rendering platform agnostically out of the box, just as a happenstance for the architecture of Daffodil. So that kind of covers a lot of the kind of the core features. I'll talk about maybe one more final feature of Daffodil before I open this up. On top of, we've talked about a lot of things in terms of architecture things, but one final thing that I think is pretty cool is we also have like a component kit. It's a functionally defined component kit. So if you're familiar with component kits in terms of UI tools, most component kits have some concept of state to them. All of the Daffodil components are intended to be stateless. So yeah, you have inputs and outputs on your component, but there's no state contained within the component. So like if you have a button, you can change an input on the button and it changes colors, or you can change the size on the button and it changes sizes, and you can even do this dynamically, and that's just a side effect of Angular. But our component kit is functionally defined. We don't store any weird state. So in terms of If you were to consider like state rehydration after like a page refresh, you can simply rehydrate state, and your UI takes it exactly back to where your user was before they refreshed the page. So little cool features of Daffodil. So I'm gonna pause for a second here and open up to any questions in the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, or if you think there's something that you'd like me to cover comparatively. Then while I'm sitting here, I'll quickly talk about like the component kit. So Daffodil has the component kit that we call Design, and it's just simply an npm package that you can download off of the npm registry. I'm not sure about Vue Storefront. Vue Storefront may have its own design kit. I don't know if it's well separated. I know I did see some time ago that there was a component kit being written that was specific to ecommerce. I don't know where that went. I haven't looked at that in a while, but I do know that's a thing. And then I know that Peregrine is the component kit for Venia or PWA Studio. So each of these vendors, including Daffodil, we each have a component kit. Maybe they're slightly different in the affordances they provide. Obviously, all look different. Each one will look different than the others. But the key differences between each of these frameworks is obviously each one is a different core language. Daffodil is Angular, PWA Studio is React, and Vue Storefront is Vue. And then the only really key difference beyond the core choice of language, or not language really, but rather framework, is going to end up being how the middleware is implemented and what affordances the PWA framework is provided. We had a very particular decision where we abuse some of the compiler behaviors of Angular, or the compiled behaviors of Angular, to make sure that we don't actually have to have a middleware. And that's really the key difference between these three frameworks. All right, so that's essentially the high-level concepts. I don't see any questions in the chat right now, but I do want to hang out for a little bit. So if anyone there in the chat, there's a bunch of users from the Daffodil core team. So I myself, Damien, Nolan Arnold, Peter Locke, who just talked in the chat, and Luke Derrick, and I believe Elaine is in the chat as well. We're all kind of core members. But if you have any questions, feel free to either ping one of us on Twitter or YouTube or Slack if you're in a Slack channel with us. We have a jitter for the repo. We also have a spectrum. We're currently debating on which one to keep. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ping us in any of these things. But Peter asked an interesting question, so I want to kind of address it. So could you walk through a start-to-finish operation in Vue Storefront and Daffodil and compare them? So for example, adding an item to the cart and updating that cart with a response. Sure. So Vue Storefront, Vue in general, doesn't do things like Redux. So Redux is a big state diagram which stores global state of the entire application in one big JSON object. Vue Storefront is slightly different in this regard in that it's got a similar paradigm, but it basically stores state in an object that is then rendered into the virtual DOM. But they're basically just two big trees. So they're very similar in terms of the state rendering. So I'm not gonna talk about that particular piece. They have slight differences, but I'm not gonna talk about the rendering engines. But let's just start with a request. So I will start with an add to cart request because it's a simple workflow that I think most people kind of understand. So in Daffodil, when you click add to cart, you will generate an action. That action will trigger a state mutation, and then subsequent to that state mutation, it will trigger an effect. So a state mutation, if you're familiar with Redux, I'm just referring to a reducer. But this is basically like, okay, when I click add to cart, I would like to show a loading icon, or like a loading indicator. So maybe when we click add to cart, the cart state has a loading attribute, and the cart state goes into loading. loading becomes true. After that, it triggers an effect, which if you're familiar with React or React Redux, this is called like a saga. So it triggers a saga, which is a sequence of events. That action will trigger the effect, which will make an HTTP request over to whatever platform is configured for the appropriate driver. So in this case, we're talking about the cart driver, and right now there's only the Magento driver at the moment. So the Magento driver will be used, and as a result, it'll send a GraphQL request over to the Magento instance that you've configured. Magento will respond, and the response will be going back into the effect. So if you're familiar with RxJS, I'm talking about a pipe here, but it's going to basically have a promise. The promise corresponds to a success and a failure. If the add to cart succeeds, it will trigger another action. Let's say add item success. Add item success will then cause a subsequent state mutation. The state mutation is going to basically turn loading off, maybe add a new item to the cart items array on the cart object, and then all of a sudden in the UI, because of the way Angular works and the way NGRX works, and these are all libraries within that Daffodil utilizes, the user sees no longer the loading GIF, and additionally a cart item in their cart. And this is all agnostic. And I haven't talked about, notice, I want to make it very clear here, I haven't talked about any actual implementation of UI. I haven't said, well, the button is here on the page, and I haven't said, well, the cart item that I'm adding looks like a certain way. I've just described a sequence of events in any arbitrary UI. That's, from a paradigm perspective, that's really what Daffodil is. It's a wrapping framework on top of a set of behaviors that can be applied to an arbitrary e-commerce application. So as a comparative example, very similar things happen in Vue Storefront. So a user will click on some arbitrary button, and the request gets made, and I believe that Vue Storefront uses promises, so we're not talking about observables here or RxJS, we're talking about an actual promise. So the promise will succeed, and the UI state will be updated. But I'll take one step back. The request we made. The request is going to be made to an Elasticsearch instance, and this is the unified middleware. So Vue Storefront has this Elasticsearch instance which pulls data from a bunch of different sources, conglomerates them into this big aggregate Elasticsearch instance, and then you as an app developer just make requests to this Elasticsearch instance, which is a very well normalized form of data, and you retrieve it back, and you get the response you expect always, and the outgoing request and the incoming response are always the same form. Just comparatively with Daffodil, because our middleware doesn't exist, we're always making, depending on platform, a different request. Vue Storefront is platform agnostic. It supports this kind of multi-platform paradigm. Our requests always look different for every platform, whereas for Vue Storefront, the requests always look the same because they handle all of this complexity within their Elasticsearch middleware. So as a result, so Vue Storefront will get the response back to you, and it'll be of a very well-defined form, and you just then render it, and you're done. Just to kind of juxtapose that to Daffodil, we have to take the Daffodil style of request that's specific to Daffodil, pass it through a transformation layer, hand that off to the particular driver. The driver gives it back to us after it succeeds or fails, and then we transform it back again into the Daffodil form, and then you can render it. Now, from a developer experience perspective, it's going to feel like it's the same thing, because a developer in both library worlds only considers in the Daffodil world the Daffodil model of a cart, and then on the other side, uh, yes, correct, Peter. It does require additional backend services. Um, Whereas on the Vue Storefront side, it's always the Vue Storefront model of a cart, but the difference is in Daffodil, the transformation from a Daffodil cart to a uh, platform-specific cart occurs on the front end in the browser, whereas in Vue Storefront, that occurs on the other side of the backend service in the Elasticsearch instance. And Daniel asked a question. So he wants to know about server-side rendering. So I'll give some good answers here. So a lot of the server-side rendering behaviors of Daffodil are actually not Daffodil specific behaviors. They're actually allocated off to the Angular Universal Rendering Engine. So Angular actually provides out of the box server-side rendering support. We don't actually have to do much in that regard. Now, there are some considerations that we have to make, and I'll talk about those very particularly. So one of the considerations that we have to make is that we store certain information in the browser. So I'm going to give a specific example of a cart ID. The cart ID needs to be stored in the browser somewhere. And as a result, when you go to render your app on the server, we actually don't know what your cart ID is because that's over in the browser. So we have to have considerations, especially in a server-side rendering context, to say, oh, well, when we don't have cart ID on the server, we really need to make sure that we don't go making carts on the server. Because so, for example, when you load a Daffodil app for the very first time, we have a cart resolution step, which basically resolves if you have a cart ID, it resolves to a new cart, or if you don't have a cart ID, it'll create a cart for you. On the server, we don't want to basically go creating carts because there is no cart ID. So we have server-side rendering considerations around not only the UI that we immediately present to the user as soon as the render completes, but also behaviors that occur on the server. And this is all controllable and modifiable by the Angular Universal Rendering Engine. We don't actually have to do tremendous amounts of effort to get server-side rendering in Angular. It's essentially a single couple steps to add the universal rendering module to Angular and build the node server that comes from the rendering module. You serve two things when you actually deploy a universal application, and if you actually go look in the Daffodil repo, the daff.io website, I will actually pull that up really quickly. This website is a server-side rendered Angular application. Now this doesn't use Daffodil, it's simply a simple Angular application. But when you go to render something like this, you actually deploy two things. You deploy the browser form of Angular, and then you also deploy the server-side rendering engine form of Angular, or the form of your application. And each of them has the same code basically. So you're technically deploying the code twice. It's not the final app is actually quite small, so don't worry about like the different sizes. But what happens is you render the app, the same exact Angular app, you render on the server, and then it comes back to the browser, and Angular performs a rehydration step of UI code, and then it's done. So in terms of behaviors, there's actually not a lot of specific Daffodil handling of server-side rendering. It's actually mostly just Angular. This is a good question, though. But I don't see any additional questions. So I'll talk maybe one final thing about kind of where we're at and where we're going. So all of the the packages that I've described today, and I have only really talked about contact and cart, they're actually all currently available on the NPM registry. They are MIT licensed packages. They are deployable off the registry. You basically just have to run an npm install in an existing Angular application, and you get the code. Um, there's not like a tremendous amount of configuration that you have to do, um, but we have at the moment 13 unique packages that are distinct or really helpful in e-commerce. So I think we have like a contact package, a navigation package for retrieving like menu items. We have a checkout package, which is maybe complicated and probably shouldn't exist for a variety of reasons. Um, but we have a product package, a category package, quite a number of them, in fact. But you can go look at the list. It's on the README on the Daffodil repo. Um, but we have a number of packages which are installable. Current version of Daffodil is 0.8.2. It's very pre-release. We have a lot of features and behaviors which work quite nicely, but we're not quite ready to say that it should be deployed into a production environment. We really need some more documentation. That's kind of really one of our weak points right now is documentation. But we basically need more documentation. We'd like to have some, more members of the open source community be involved and give us some feedback on the developer experience of utilizing Daffodil. Right now, we use it internally. We dog food this to ourselves on the team, but we don't really have great verification externally of, hey, this package is really cool, but it's really hard to install, or the documentation here is not so good, so maybe clarify it. Right now, we're kind of reliant a little bit on ourselves to make sure that we do something really nice for the community. Or not just the community, but developers in general who want to use something like Daffodil. But that covers kind of the high-level concepts within Daffodil. So where are we going? The plan is to add more packages. We would like to get into account management, so we haven't quite gotten to the customer step in terms of like saving accounts. We're chiefly focused on kind of the guest checkout workflow at the moment and kind of honing out that experience. But accounts are going to be important. Maybe we'll get into various behaviors. So right now, one of the packages that's kind of in discussion about how we want to approach it is like a content management package. So, for example, maybe you want to use AEM, or maybe you want to use WordPress, or maybe you want to use Contentful for your content, but you'd like to use Magento for your e-commerce. We haven't fully extracted out the content API yet, but the concept would be basically, you can hybridize your application in any way you'd like. If you'd like to use Magento for e-commerce and WordPress for whatever, you can do that. And additional, I'm going to make a very minor statement that's not going to be super easy to understand. If you wanted to even do multiple content drivers at the same time, you can actually do that. So Angular supports a hierarchical injector. So if you wanted to say have WordPress be most of your content for the entire site, and then a completely different WordPress instance be used by your legal team for like a small portion of like your privacy policy and your content policy, you could do that. You could even swap it to not be WordPress. You could use WordPress for the majority of your site, and then Contentful just for the legal pages, and you could do that as well. So a lot of different behaviors that are enabled by Angular's hierarchical injector that are pretty useful. But those are super, super advanced behaviors that if you're just kind of getting into Daffodil for the first time or Angular for the first time, you're not going to utilize out of the gate. But it's nice to know that if you had to do that, or if it was a business requirement, we have the flexibility to be able to do that pretty easily. So Peter asked, does Daffodil's generics enable greater extensibility over Vue Storefront and PWA Studio? That's a really good question, and it's something that I missed. So important note here, Angular and thus Daffodil are written in TypeScript. So you're utilizing a very well-typed pair of packages. So the Angular packages and the Daffodil packages are very well typed. So they are strictly typed. And basically, if let's say for example, back to the contact example, let's say I originally said that maybe Daffodil has like a name and an email. Let's say you want to throw something else in there, like oh, what's a good example? Like a message body. Like you want to say something. You don't want to just say, "Hey, come call me." You want to say, "Hey, call me because of this." Uh, you can actually extend upon the Daffodil models, and you can extend them type safely based upon our generic layer. So we have a layer of generics around all of this UI code, which allows you to extend upon core models, expand upon the transformations that occur that send off to the platform, so that the resulting code that you send off is completely configurable by you, and everything is repurposable. So if you want to not repurposeful, yes, but replaceable is probably the better word there. You can actually swap out anything that you want for anything else. If you don't like, so for example, the cart is actually not just one driver. It is kind of one global driver of a platform, but within the driver, there's like a cart address driver that covers, updating the billing address on the cart. Or there's a cart shipping address driver which controls updating shipping addresses on the cart. If you wanted to overwrite one specific driver of a package, you can do that. You don't actually have to rewrite the entire thing. You can dependency inject over a lot of those layers, so that if you wanted to just modify or take advantage of a specific behavior for a specific platform in one specific context, you can do so. And as I said, all of these injectors are injectable in a hierarchical format. So if you want to do this in different layers of your hierarchy or different areas of your application, so let's say in this specific area, you'd like to use like the default Daffodil drivers, but maybe in this fast checkout area you want to use a specialized subset to make things easier, you can do that. All right, so test coverage. Yeah, test coverage is a really good question. At the moment, I think we have something like 1,600 tests. We have quite a good amount of unit tests. We have a fair amount of integration tests. Integration tests and unit tests in Angular are a little bit weird because they tend to be in the same files. UI code is a little bit strange when it comes to testing in terms of separation of integration from unit, because a lot of times you're testing DOM behavior, or you're kind of looking at DOM behavior, and as a result, you're not just simply testing a pure function. You're talking about, what did this do to the DOM, or what does the user see? So we have I think around 1,600. I'm going to call them hybrid integration unit tests. Some of our pure functions, I think all of our pure functions in the core library are very well tested, and I think we have something like 97% test coverage of that. And you also mentioned extensibility, so I talked about extensibility quite a bit. As I said, almost everything within Daffodil is extensible and replaceable. So if you wanted to use the bulk of it, so two unique concepts. If you want to use one package but not another, you can do that. If you want to use one package but swap out a driver, you can do that. If you want to use the driver but replace the object type that you're transforming and messing with, you can do that too. So a lot of different layers of extensibility around how you as an end user interact with Daffodil. And as a final comment here, because I want to make it very clear, I haven't said anything about the actual user interface. I've only described the developer side behaviors. The UI that a user sees is entirely up to you. If you want to make it look however you'd like, you can do that. The design library for Daffodil is much like Angular Material. It's simply a way to help you build your UI faster if you don't have a well-defined component kit. But if you want to bring your own component kit and build your own UI, you can do that too. And additionally, if you wanted to like theme the design library, that's well supported as well. So like if you want to just like use our component kit but change the colors to look like your brand's colors, you can do that too. So if not under NDA, some sites built with it, how much of your current drivers target Magento? Does it require modules on the Magento 2 side? That's a good question. So we do have an NDA, so really there's mostly kind of one site that's fully described or well described at this moment. I cannot explicitly state who the client is, but suffice it to say, in the very near future, I will be able to. So how much of your current drivers target Magento? At this point, almost every package has a Magento driver. There are some unique exceptions because there are limitations of Magento. So for example, contact. So Magento doesn't support a contact API either on GraphQL or REST. So we have a HubSpot driver for that at the moment. Same thing for newsletter. So newsletter there's no concept of well, there are the APIs exist, or the code exists on Magento side, but the APIs don't exist. So those are two packages where there are HubSpot drivers instead of Magento drivers. And there is actually a Shopify product driver. So for our product library, if you wanted to pull products out of Shopify, we have a driver for that at the moment. So most of our packages have a Magento driver. All of them are GraphQL drivers. We actually don't have any REST drivers at the moment. We haven't had a need for them yet. So does it require modules on the M2 side? At the moment, actually, no. There is only one module that's not explicitly necessary, that if you would like to use it, you can. So this is the orders module. So let's say once you have placed an order, you want to retrieve more information about the order that was just placed. So for example, you want, like right now, if you look at the Magento GraphQL APIs, there's only a increment ID and like a grand, I don't even know if there's a grand total, maybe a customer email. It's not a lot of things. Like there's 4 fields. We do have a module which it's an open source module that allows you to retrieve more than that. So we utilize the cart ID. So we do a lookup against the cart ID to see whether or not you have access to the order, and we can pull some more fields that way. So we'll search for an order through the cart ID and retrieve it, and we have a model of an order around that API. But that's the only exception. Everything else doesn't require any secondary software. You run Angular, and you run the Daffodil packages for the Angular application, and that's it. Yeah, so an interesting consideration, just specifically for Magento 2.4 that came out today, they dropped support for the payment methods. And surprisingly enough, they actually don't have the payment methods off the Magento marketplace do not have REST API or GraphQL drivers yet, or at least last I checked, which is I think 3 days ago. So for example, authorize.net, which is one of the packages that we have, all of a sudden the wool gets pulled out underneath you, and no longer is there an API that you can actually work with. So we're probably going to eventually have to change that API around because it's only compatible with 2.3.5. It's not compatible with 2.4 as a result of the breaking change. But this, I mean, I'm going to come back to this. This all draws on the original fact that this all draws on the fact that like Daffodil arose from a need to migrate from Magento 1 to Magento 2, and to do so without having to retrain, or not even retrain, just train anybody on Magento front-end code. We didn't want to, make all of our front-end devs learn how to utilize layout XML or use the Magento theming hierarchies. At the time, it didn't make any sense. It was too time intense. It was too niche specific. So what we ended up doing was, building a way for us to be maybe a little bit more tolerant to underlying changes in Magento without having to worry about, Magento breaking something and then us having to scramble to fix it. We wanted a way to be able to swap in and out behaviors so that, if, let's say, Magento removes an API, we can swim, like context, a simple example. If Magento drops support for the contact API, we can swap it to another service really trivially without having to go, rewrite a big piece of our application. We can just swap a driver and move on. And the customer, from a customer side, their UI remains the same. They don't notice the difference. You just swap a driver and the UI is the exact same. Some abstractions around OmniPay, generic library for payment service providers in M2, which intends to make it easier for front-end devs to integrate payment methods with common front-end APIs. Yeah, that'd be really cool actually. The one difference though is that the generic library is is it somewhat enforces, I mean, because you have to write module code for Magento 2, it would require a developer to um, go, install specific Magento 2 code. That's something we try to avoid as much as we can. We try to avoid having to modify the actual underlying platform to work with Daffodil. We try to work with their APIs as close as we can. Um, but to that end, let's say you wanted to do that. Adding a new Daffodil driver is, I don't want to say trivial, but it's very easy. You can swap in a service. So we have an interface which describes the requirements of a driver. You just have to write a class that meets the requirements of the interface, provide the actual class. You can write a little npm package to do this, or you don't even need to write an npm package. You can actually just do this in your Angular app. And in your instance, you'd be writing another Magento 2 module for your specific thing. You make it meet the Daffodil API, you make your requests, and you're done. You don't have to do anything special in terms of having to ask us to go write driver code particularly for your use case. We provide some drivers, but if you want to add your own in your own module context or in your own app context, you can do that. It's very easy. Yeah, and as Peter points out, we're always accepting contributions. We are, very thankful for the individuals who have contributed open source code to Daffodil. Um, it is it's the one of the greatest things in the world. It warms my heart whenever I see anyone open up a pull request or open up an issue, even even if it's to say our code sucks and XYZ thing is really really broken. It's a really wonderful feeling to know that someone's looking at your work and they're trying to get utility out of it. And even if they're struggling, they're willing to say, hey, we'd like to make it better. So if you are an open source developer and you want to contribute, um, any effort is appreciated, even if it's doc writing. Um, it's a really fantastic feeling for us as maintainers to be able to do this and build this software and you know hopefully make it easier for developers to write front end UI code for e-commerce. That's really our goal here. And I'll leave this open for maybe about another minute. I do have to hop off. I'm going to be on another meeting. But if anyone has any questions or is curious to learn more about Daffodil, send an email to hello@greatcore.io if you want to send an email. If you find me on Slack, if you want to tweet us on Twitter, it's at greatcore.io. If you want to leave a comment on the video, um, please do so. But basically, do whatever you'd like to try and get in contact with us. I personally monitor almost all of our communication channels. Um, but yeah, so please feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear more from you guys. We work on Daffodil for our own stuff. It is open source though. But so we review all contributions. We're very particular about coding standards and test-driven development. So if you want to do a contribution, we'll help you out along the way. Uh, but any advice to us is appreciated. Any questions that you have will be answered as best as we can. Uh, but thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all of your times. I think we have 13 viewers at the moment. You guys are all fantastic. Um, Thanks so much.